You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Welcome to the 9th episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Bassetto, PhD student at the University of Copenhagen. Thanks for joining us. And if you like what we're doing, please share the podcast on your social media accounts. You can find us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast, as well as on Facebook, facebook.com/Social Media and Politics Podcast. This episode is going to be all about ISIS, Twitter, and terrorism. One of the main challenges facing governments in the 21st century is combating global terrorism. Terror-related atrocities are on the rise in several traditional conflict hotspots, like the Middle East and Africa, which is a real-world consequence of complex geopolitical instabilities in those regions. However, social media and other digital communication technologies are allowing terrorist organizations to broadcast their message to a wider public than ever before, and organizations like ISIS have demonstrated innovative and tech-savvy means of harnessing social media as a tool for propaganda and a way to recruit fighters. Twitter, in particular, having a more open and public network structure than Facebook, can serve as a platform for ISIS to identify and contact potential foreign fighters, those who live outside of conflict zones but leave home to join the front lines in Syria and Iraq. Tweets can translate into fighters on the battlefield, but due to Twitter's global reach, they can also recruit lone wolves to lash out in their own countries, prompting a serious security challenge to the West and the next U.S. presidential administration in particular. September 11th was a large-scale terror attack resulting from an intricately designed plot by an organization with substantial financial resources. 15 years on, digital communication technologies have greatly simplified the terrain for inciting smaller-scale terror attacks with a global reach and increased frequency. So it's critical to understand not just how terrorist organizations like ISIS are using social media, but also how discussions about ISIS are taking place on platforms like Twitter. Although researchers are still grappling with ways to approach and analyze these new phenomena, some general trends can be observed from preliminary work on ISIS Twitter data from 2014 and 2015. As of then, pro-ISIS accounts are estimated to be somewhere in the range of 45 to 75,000, and they overwhelmingly tweet in Arabic. English pro-ISIS accounts are generally under 1,000 at any given time. Pro-ISIS Twitter users, although outnumbered by ISIS critical accounts 6 to 1, are highly active and mostly located in Iraq or Syria. Twitter, under political pressure to reduce ISIS's ability to recruit foreign fighters, has taken steps towards shutting down pro-ISIS accounts by increasing the size of its Twitter threat team. The company announced that it had shut down more than 125,000 pro-ISIS accounts, but as we'll get into in just a second, this number can be a bit misleading, and closing down ISIS supporters' accounts may actually have some unintended consequences. Joining me today to talk about ISIS and Twitter is Dr. Luigi Carini, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Milan. Dr. Carini is an expert on social media analysis, especially when it comes to citizens' voting behavior, electoral campaigns, and political ideologies. He is also co-founder of Voices from the Blogs, an academic company spun off from the University of Milan that uses digital data for predictive analytics, business intelligence, and sentiment analysis. Dr. Carini and his colleagues in Milan have developed a refined method of sentiment analysis and applied it to a corpus of approximately 2 million Arabic tweets about ISIS from 53 countries. The findings of that study have been featured in The Guardian and The Washington Post. If you're interested in Dr. Carini's work, you can check out his webpage, www.luigicarini.com, or follow him on Twitter, @Carini. That's @CURINI. He has a book out due in February 2017 entitled Politics and Big Data, Nowcasting and Forecasting Elections with Social Media, published by Routledge Press. Dr. Carini, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for taking the time out to share your insights with us.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
Great. So before we launch into ISIS and your Twitter study, you've been doing a lot of research recently using sentiment analysis. Can you tell us a little bit about sentiment analysis and why it's useful for research?
As a social researcher, I think that we really need to take more serious the kind of data, the kind of information that we can derive by analyzing social network or big data. I really think that the quality of information that we can derive by simply analyzing text out there can be extremely useful to better understanding the pattern of some social phenomena. And this is quite a serious thing because, let's say, for probably too long, the idea of big data was mainly linked with computer scientists, while it was somehow discarded by social scientists. And I think this is a pity, simply because there are a lot of information available out there. I mean, there are millions and millions of tweets on posts on Facebook, on Instagram, whatever, that are just published on several different type of topics. And some of those topics are clearly crucial and relevant for social scientists. So simply discarding those type of information is a kind of thing that is not anymore something that is reasonable as a social researcher right now. So, and the idea of sentiment analysis, just very broad definition for a type of technique that try to infer information from analyzing digital text. And there are several difference between different types of sentiment analysis techniques, and probably we're going to discuss a bit more about that. But still, the idea is very simple. We are social researcher. As a social researcher, we need information to understand social reality. We cannot discard information regarding social reality. Nowadays, the big part of information available is on big data on social network, and it is better for us to start to analyze in a serious way those type of information.
And I think one thing that's interesting about it is, generally social scientists ask, participants questions via survey data, which has a sort of bias built in, right? When people know they're being asked questions, they might answer differently. So can you talk a little bit about what it means to just get social media data kind of from the source?
Yeah, let's say that it's a completely different type of approach. I mean, if you think about survey, it's a really top-down approach. I mean, it is the researcher that has to think about the questions, that has to administer to the people that have to decide to respond or not to that. Once you start to analyze social media, you need to you just change your perspective from a top-down to a bottom-up approach. I mean, in that case, you are not asking people anything. You are just simply decide to analyze what those people decide to write in a completely free way about all the topics that they want to discuss about. And that's quite crucial, because in some given instance, if you think about the election, for example, in some given instance, there is a kind of social conformism in the kind of answer that people gives to survey. And on the other side, people can be much more free to say what they want and what they really think by just writing something on social media. I mean, go back to the election in U.S. presidential election 2016. I mean, the victory of Trump was a big surprise for the pollster companies. But once you start to really think a bit better about that, it wasn't a surprise at all. I mean, if you think, now we know that the majority of white females decide to vote for Donald Trump. But I mean, imagine a situation where you are contacted by a poster by phone after that the Washington Post has published the video involving, the Donald Trump sexual harassment. I mean, that kind of type of video. I mean, if you're a woman, although you would be ready to support Donald Trump, you're going to say to another person on the phone, I mean, you're sincere voting. But on the other side, once you are on social media, you are much more free to say that, or at least you are much more free, for example, to criticize much more Hillary Clinton compared to Donald Trump. And we can, as a social researcher, try to infer something about that type of a behavior. So this is just an example where actually there is a huge gap by the type of information that you can derive from survey on some specific topic. And I'm talking about hot topic. Electoral behavior sometimes can be an extremely hot topic where there is a lot of social conformism, but I can also think about some other hot topic, like, for example, all civil rights topics that clearly is a hot topic. Migration is another hot topic. And also, if we are talking about ISIS, if we think about terrorism or social support towards some extremist group, that's another hot topic where people probably are not going to say what they really think on a survey, but on the other side, when they are free to express their own view on social media, the kind of information that they express on social media probably is much more true, is much more closer to their sincere belief that the type of information you can get by using, for example, a survey.
Right. And when we talk about sentiment analysis, it's generally, how positive or negative are the opinions toward a given topic. And there's plenty of reasons for researchers and companies to be skeptical of sentiment analysis, and rightly so. It's hard to capture with computational tools opinions coming from users. So can you talk a little bit about that and how you and your colleagues in Milan have kind of gotten around some of the difficulties with sentiment analysis?
Let's say that there are out there three main type of approaches in terms of sentiment analysis. The first one, as you were just mentioning, is just a pure computational approach. For example, you go back to the election example. You want to try to predict who is going to win the election by counting something. For example, counting the mention about Trump or Hillary, or counting the number of followers, or counting the number of likes. This is clearly quite inefficient because by counting something, you are not really able to understand which is the opinion of the person discussing about some given topic, okay? Because you're just simply counting something. Then there is a second approach that is, the approach based, for example, machine learning approaches or natural language process. And in this case, what you're trying to do is just trying to identify the opinion, for example, pro or cons about a given topic or on each single post. And then you try to, by summing up, you try to recover the general opinion on social media about a given topic. The problem with this approach, there are two big problems. The first one is that, for example, if you use a natural language process, you are using a dictionary. And using a dictionary can be quite problematic because actually people sometimes when they discuss about a given topic, they use a lot of humor, they use a lot of double meaning. This is something very difficult to extract by using a dictionary. And the second problem is related to a statistical problem because once you try to identify the opinion on each single post and then you aggregate, the risk is that the kind of mistake that you get on the aggregate can be very, very, very large. Our approach is very different. Our approach is based on a two-step procedure. In the very first step, we manually codify a subsample of all the posts about a given topic. And this is quite crucial because in the human stage, there are, people that read and codify the posts. And this is crucial because people are much better than machine to understand the meaning expressed on some given text. They are able to understand jokes. They are really able to understand what's happening in that particular sentence. In the second stage, there is an algorithm that learns from the human codification the association between a given language and the sentiment expressed on some given topic. And what is doing the algorithm is not classifying each single post that does not be codified by human, but already identify the aggregate distribution. And that's the statistical trick to decrease the overall error that you can have by analyzing large number of posts. Seems a very tricky thing because you should get the same thing by classifying each single individual tweet or post and then aggregating them, or on the other side, as we do, directly estimate the aggregate distribution. But in reality, if you go back to, we wrote several statistical papers about that, there is a huge difference. If the thing that you care about is the aggregate distribution, you really need to have a different kind of approach as the one that we're using. And the last advantages of our approach is that we can move beyond the simple sentiment analysis that is just identifying a post as a positive or negative or neutral about a given topic. But we can also run an opinion mining that is trying to identify which are the main reason behind a positive or negative sentiment toward a given topic. Because once again, as a social researcher, we are also very much interested about the reasons behind why a person or a group of people decide to give a positive or a negative judgment about some given topic. And that's exactly what our technique allows us to do.
And I think it's super interesting that you applied this method to tweets about ISIS. So could you tell us a little bit about the motivations behind that study? What were you trying to find out?
But once again, it goes back to the fact that after all, we are social researchers. I mean, our initial, when we were contacted by The Guardian to run the preliminary analysis that has been published there in November 2014, our main concern, let's say like that, was that basically we really do know a little about what Arabic people all over the world say when they are discussing about ISIS, because clearly there's a problem with language. I mean, in the Western world, there are not so many people that actually are able to read Arabic language. Mm-hmm. So the idea was that sometimes when we read, for example, an article trying to discuss how Arabic people feel about ISIS, we always need to rely on anecdotal evidence. What we wanted to do is doing something more systematic. So our effort was really try to download on some given temporal period all the tweets discussing explicitly about ISIS written in Arabic language from all over the world. We did it in the very first round, we did it in the 6 months between August and November 2014. Then we have extended our analysis, we extended our sample, go back to the half of 2015, we have analyzed almost 20 million of tweets written in Arabic language discussing about ISIS, and this kind of millions of tweets is increasing over and over, because that's something that we want to do. We want to follow the trend over time, because we really think that it's just by analyzing the trend over time that we can really try to understand something that can be quite relevant in terms of the kind of image that we have in the Western world regarding ISIS and the Arabic world.
And as I mentioned, there's only about, at any given time, less than 1,000 accounts tweeting about ISIS in English, whereas there's 75,000 of those tweeting in Arabic. So I think you definitely looked at the right data to use. And can you talk a little bit about how you applied your method of sentiment analysis to those tweets, and what did you find?
Actually, to apply our approach to this type of data, we ran, because as I told you, we have this two-stage analysis. So in the very first stage, in this case, we relied on 2 graduate students, one from Egypt and the other one from Morocco, that is, were native Arabic speaker. This clearly was quite relevant, because we really wanted to have some people that was really able to understand the content of the language used when discussing about ISIS. And this was the very first thing that we learned, because sometimes, you really need to be native and fluent in Arabic language to really understand some kind of jokes, particular type of words that you use when you want to refer in a positive or negative way toward a given topic, in this case about ISIS. Right. So what we did is we basically download all the tweets discussing explicitly about ISIS. We have a bunch of keywords that we use to download that. And after that, the 2 Arabic coders did their work. The algorithm was able to retrieve some information. And as I told you, we ran the analysis in 2 different ways. In the first way, we focused on the first 6 months, then we extended our analysis. And once again, we didn't want just to understand the evolution of the sentiment. That was clearly one thing that was important. We really wanted to understand which were the factors that were affecting the trend of the sentiment toward ISIS over time. We really wanted to understand also, on one side, the main topics behind both a positive and a negative attitude toward ISIS. And the second thing, we also wanted to understand a regional distribution of support, let's say ISIS sentiment, over different countries all over the world, because we also thought that was possibly another interesting topic.
And yeah, I thought one of the interesting things is that you found that most of the pro-ISIS tweets were actually coming from Europe, right?
We are talking about November 2014. For example, we found among the European countries, Belgium was the one with the largest percentage of tweets that actually were expressing a positive attitude toward ISIS. And once again, we are talking about November 2014. All the terrorist attacks that happened after this November 2014. So something that we must remind about that. And as you were saying, yes, there were a lot of tweets coming from Europe. Belgium, France, UK were actually 3 countries where a lot of tweets were coming discussing about ISIS. And this was one of the first things that we were surprised about. Of course, we were expecting a lot of tweets, and we found a lot of tweets from the Arabic world discussing about ISIS. If you think about Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iraq and Syria, of course, Egypt. But, I mean, finding all those tweets also coming from European countries was something quite interesting.
Yeah, and one thing that I found super interesting, so placing our listeners back in the context of when you collected your tweets, this was when you had a lot of the videos being posted about the beheadings, for example, of a British aid worker named David Haynes. There was an increased military response from U.S. and coalition forces in the region in terms of airstrikes. And something that you found was that violence didn't quite affect sentiment in the way that you expected.
Absolutely. For example, what we find out is that the impact of violence on the sentiment toward ISIS really depends on the kind of target of ISIS. That is, when the target is viewed somehow as illegitimate by the constituents, in that particular case, we found out that the sentiment toward ISIS decreased a lot. For example, if you remember, there was a moment where actually ISIS captured and then burned alive Muad Kazazbea. He was a military from Lebanon. And in that case, this simple fact decreased a lot the sentiment toward ISIS. On the other case, the beheading of Western people didn't have any kind of impact on the sentiment toward ISIS. This was, let's say, it wasn't that much surprising, but somehow underline something that really always jumps out when you analyze terrorist group. If you go back to in the 70s, when you were analyzing the terrorist action from the extreme left groups, for example, you always find out that violence committed by the extreme left group, for example, in Europe, for example, in Italy, affected the support toward the terrorist group only when the target of the extreme left terrorist group were people working for the trade union, so somehow related to the same constituents of the extreme left terrorist group. And this is something that we found out also by analyzing ISIS. On the other side, the thing that we find out is that huge terrorist attack in Europe, for example, think about Charlie Hebdo. Mm-hmm. I mean, in that case, we found out that this kind of attack increased a lot the discussion about ISIS, of course, within the Arabic social media community. And the short-term effect was clearly decreasing the support toward ISIS. But what we find out with Charlie Hebdo, with several other attacks, what we find out is that this decrease in the sentiment toward ISIS was really short-term, usually lasted between 2 and 3 days, and 2 and 4 days actually. And after that, the sentiment toward ISIS returns to the average that we always found out. And that's another interesting thing. It's the idea that the memory of the internet was really short-term, because actually it just lasted for very few days. And after that, everything returned to the mean.
Mm. And what was driving the pro and anti sentiment towards ISIS, as I understand it, had a lot to do with Islam, right? Can you talk a little bit about the role of Islam in the pro and anti sentiment?
Absolutely. This one was one of the most fascinating results that we got, because, I mean, if you think about ISIS from a Western point of view, sometimes ISIS is really related to religion. And by analyzing this tweet, what we find out is that actually religion was the single most important reason, both for supporting ISIS, the idea that ISIS was doing to defend Islamic religion, but it was also the main reason behind negative sentiment. Around 1/3 of the negative tweets about ISIS were just saying, explicitly criticized ISIS because it was using religion for political aims. And let's say that this was a very reassuring result, because once you analyze those tweets, you find that this religious cleavage is not something that is out there, precisely because religion is both the main reason behind supporting ISIS and the main reason behind attacking ISIS. So it was quite reassuring, because it wasn't related to a cleavage separating, Islamic world from the Western world. This is something that we didn't find out, and that was really something that they really showed that within the Arabic war, I mean, the type of the discussion about ISIS is a bit more complex than what we think, and that the religion is also the main reason why people within Arabic world, they are criticizing ISIS.
Right, which I think is super interesting. And there's kind of, Twitter has been getting a lot of pressure from government saying that they need to take more action in closing down ISIS accounts. And just doing a little bit of background research, I thought it was quite interesting that ISIS and other terrorist organizations, they seem to use Twitter to make contact with potential recruits, and then they start moving to direct message, and then they move the conversation entirely off into some sort of third-party app like WhatsApp or Wickr that is encrypted. So Twitter's taken these steps. They've closed down a lot of pro-ISIS accounts, and you find that this actually might have a quite interesting effect. Can you talk about this, the loneliness effect, as you call it?
Yeah, I mean, what we find out, I mean, by once again analyzing our data, is that there is actually in our data a negative relationship between the positive sentiment of ISIS and the number of foreign fighters from different countries. So let's say in those countries where there is the highest sentiment support over ISIS are also those countries that present the lower number of foreign fighters and vice versa. Once again, in this type of analysis, we are not analyzing just European countries, we are analyzing countries from all over the world, because that's quite crucial, because sometimes, I mean, all the research on foreign fighters usually always focus on the foreign fighter from the Western world that decide to leave Europe or US to move to Syria, but it's also very important to understand the foreign fighter coming from the Arabic war, all the different countries in our data set. What we found out there was this kind of negative relationship between positive sentiment of ISIS and the number of foreign fighters. This kind of result was pretty robust. And what's happening that? As I told you, at the first sight, it was surprising. But I mean, if we go back, for example, to Hirschman theory, I mean, and if you go back to the accent and voice framework, this is not surprising anymore, because imagine a situation where you want to express your support over ISIS. Basically, you have two main options. The first one, you can rely on the voice option. That is, you go on social media and you just tweet about your support about ISIS. Or if you are not allowed to do that, you rely on the exit option. That is, you leave your own country and you move to Syria to fight for ISIS. And what we find out is exactly like that. I mean, this kind of loneliness effect is really related to the fact that censorship, that is shutting down Twitter accounts, is not a good idea, precisely because you increase the so-called lone wolf effect. I mean, you really doesn't allow a person to freely express what he wants by using some censorship, and by doing that, you get as a result something that you really do not want, that is the increased number of foreign fighters. And that's something that's very difficult to make understand to the public opinion, because actually the idea is that shutting down Twitter accounts or any other Twitter accounts is always discussing about ISIS is always a good idea. But according to our data, it's not at all a good idea. Also because imagine that you work for the Secret Service. It's a good thing if you can follow people tweeting on Twitter about ISIS, because this is something that you can easily follow. I mean, if you do not allow anymore those people to tweet about ISIS, those people, they are going still to discuss about ISIS in some other ways that you cannot control. So, I mean, once again, using censorship is never a good idea. Also, when we are talking about Islamic terrorism.
Yeah, and I think that's super interesting, because it seems that by taking away people's ability to express themselves, they feel like they have to take action another way. And I was also thinking, I mean, I think the idea behind Twitter closing down the accounts is to basically stop the follower list. So when someone opens up a new account, they lose their followers. And I think that can be quite frustrating if you're kind of someone on the edge and then you lose all of your followers that you've built. It may be frustrating enough for you then to leave and go fight on the front lines, which seems dramatic, but that seems to be what's happening.
Exactly.
So what are the next steps? Where are you going from here? Are you continuing to study ISIS and sentiment, or building on this study, perhaps?
Yes. Right now we are working on a different topic, but it's very much related to what we discussed up to now. We are working with both Oxford and Durham University, with the archaeologist department over there. And what we are analyzing, just trying to understand the reaction, once again, on social media within the Arabic world to ISIS destruction of heritage sites. Because, once again, there have been a lot of discussion about that. ISIS was using that as a kind of propaganda tool to show to the world what they're doing. And there have been a lot of discussion, once again, within Europe about such a terrible disaster. If you think about UNESCO, for example, there's been a lot of discussion about that. But once again, the discussion was mainly developed within the Western world for the Western world. What we wanted to understand is what about the reaction within the Arabic world about with respect to this act of destruction by ISIS. And what we found out, these are just our preliminary analysis, is that the kind of reaction within the Arabic world, on social media, to this action of ISIS is not independent of the type of heritage sites that have been destructed. So, for example, just to mention one, Palmyra, the destruction of Palmyra, that so much reaction produced in the Western world. If you go back to analyze what did happen within Twitter discussion within the Arabic world, we had a different type of reaction. Let's say the destruction of Palmyra didn't produce such a decrease in the sentiment toward ISIS as compared to some other destruction made by ISIS related to some other sites that are not really related to the heritage sites, but to some other sites that are much more relevant to the Arabic community compared to what is relevant to the Western community. Once again, comparing the two, I think it's quite interesting because it allows us to better understanding a bit more about the Arabic world.
And I just got to touch on your new book for a second. It's going to be out in February 2017. It's called Politics and Big Data, Nowcasting and Forecasting Elections with Social Media. So we've been talking about the Arabic world, but in the Western world, we've seen a whole bunch of recent electoral contests where traditional polling has been widely off the mark, right? The 2015 British elections, Brexit, the U.S. elections, the pollsters got it wrong in every case. So can you tell us a little bit about the book and what type of research you're doing on forecasting elections?
Actually, the book somehow summarizes our experience with analyzing election with social media, and it goes back to our first analysis that was run in 2012, both for the U.S. presidential election and French presidential and legislative election. Mm-hmm. Our idea is that, once again, going back to what we were discussing, on social media there is a lot of useful information to understand also the possible voting preference of electors in different type of contexts. What we are reporting in the books is not only reporting the kind of result that we got in analysis, but what we do is trying to analyze all the main, we are talking about around 300 analyses that have been run in these last 5 years using social media to try to predict election. And we wanted to run this type of meta-analysis on these 300 election forecasts with social media, precisely to understand which are the main factors that positively affect the probability to forecast the final result by analyzing social media. And we are able to identify which are the three main factors that affect positively the forecast based on social media. These three main factors are the method. The method is very relevant because, after all, big data are data, and you need to have a proper statistical method to analyze data. And going back to what we are discussing, we found out that using a pure computational approach is not a very good idea to try to forecast election, while machine learning does a better job. And our type of approach that try to recover directly the aggregate distribution is the single method that allows you to reduce more the average error that you can recover by trying to forecast election, the final result by using social media. Then the second factor that is really relevant is related to institutional factor. For example, we find out that It's easier to predict election via social media when you analyze, for example, election with proportional system. Why that? Because with proportional system, there is less strategic voting. We know that, for example, with the plurality system, for example, there is a difference between what you really would like to vote, your sincere voting, and your strategic voting. That is what you, after all, you are going to vote. Because, I mean, if there is a plurality system, you have a higher incentive to vote with the candidate or the party with the highest probability of winning, not the party that you really like more. While with proportional system, your incentive to vote in a strategic way are lower. And that's exactly what we found out. I mean, it's easier to predict election with a proportional system with social media, because in that case, people express on social media their sincere voting, that is actually the vote they are going to post at the polls. And finally, the last factor that really relevant is if somehow the social media are calibrated with survey. And this go back to your question. And right now, survey, I mean, the last year we have several examples where actually survey got it wrong. Sometimes they got it very wrong. Why that? One of the main reasons is related to the fact that the rate of respondent of a survey is decreasing. Right now, overall, I mean, in US, for example, the average rate of response is around 10%, actually a bit less than 10%. So it means that imagine a situation where you have created your sample that is a representative sample, so you spend a lot of money on that, and then out of that, only 10% or less than 10% is going to answer you. So this means simply that the variance of your errors is going to increase a lot, because, I mean, you started with a representative sample and you find out that actually less than 10% of your representative sample actually reply to your data. This clearly creates a problem. On the other side, by analyzing social media, there is a problem, of course, because you cannot be sure about the fact that the data that you are analyzing are somehow representative from a social demographic view of the entire electorate out there. So that's a problem with the analyzing social media. So what we found out is that those analyses that try to calibrate social media by also taking advantage of survey, so basically somehow weighting the result you get by social media by using survey, so somehow getting the best out of both worlds, are those type of analyses that are better able compared to the other one to reduce the average error. And that's exactly, for example, what we have done for the 2016 US presidential election. What we did was monitoring the last 40 days of the US presidential campaign by calibrating our analysis based on social media with actually survey results that were published on Real Clear Politics. By doing that, we were able to predict much better the final result than the survey. For example, on the national level, we predicted the victory of Hillary Clinton by 1.2, between 1.2 and 1.3. The final result is around 2 points. And on the other side, according to our model, the predicted probability for a Trump victory was 41%. So, of course, we made a mistake because it was lower than 50%, but our prediction in terms of probability was much better than, for example, the one by Nate Silver, or the one published on the New York Times, or the one published on Huffington Post, or the one run by the Princeton University, where actually they were using survey, and according to them, the predicted probability for a Trump victory was less than 1%. Clearly a huge mistake, and this type of mistakes sometimes happen precisely because we decided not to give enough weight to the information that happens on social media. Once again, a lot of people treat information on social media simply as a noise. Our book is exactly the opposite. We don't have to consider the information, the tweets or the posts on Facebook about any given topic as a rumor. On the contrary, the type of information published there is an information that can be extremely useful to better understand what's going on public opinion. According to us, public opinion has changed compared to 5-10 years ago. Public opinion has become something that is much more fluid compared to 10 or 20 years ago. Precisely for that, we need also to change the kind of methods that we traditionally have applied to analyze public opinion. Relying on survey right now is not anymore enough. There are information out there, big data out there. We need really to take serious about the challenge of big data, but we really need, as a social researcher, to understand that the kind of information that are out there, they are useful. They are something that are relevant to try to better understand social phenomena and try to better understand what's happening, hopefully, before something out there turns out to be something that we really do not like. But to understand that and to try to anticipate that, we really need to have data about that.
So from forecasting elections to identifying what drives foreign fighters. Dr. Carini, thanks for sharing your research with us. Super interesting stuff.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You've just been listening to Dr. Luigi Carini, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Milan. Look out for his new book, Politics and Big Data, Nowcasting and Forecasting Elections with Social Media, published by Routledge Press and due out February 2017. You can follow Dr. Carini on Twitter, @Carini, or visit his website at www.luigicarini.com. That's all the time we have for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Please help us share the word about the show by sharing on your social media accounts. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/Social Media and Politics Podcast, as well as our Twitter account @SMNP Podcast. Thanks to Copenhagen University for the studio, Earfunk for the jams, and Peter Orbeck for editing. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.